Okay, I'm going to start recording, and if not, I'm going to go to screen sharing, and we're going to go to the next stage of ecology. Notice we're kind of working our way up that biological hierarchy. So we're going to talk about communities. And keep in mind, we said that a community is a group of populations that live in the same area. They interact, at least indirectly. But everything we said about individual populations is also true about the populations in a community. So we don't want to think that what we talked about in terms of populations is bridge under the water and doesn't matter anymore. This kind of adds a new layer of complexity, because when we look at communities, what we're typically looking at is interactions between the populations that live in those communities. So the first type of interaction we're going to look at is predation. And one of the reasons I wanted to start with predation is because if you watch any types of specials on nature, on the Serengeti Plains in Africa, predation is one of the things that they almost always focus on. So one of the things that we do have to keep in mind is that the TV specials exaggerate predation a little bit. Why? Well, because it's whether the predator catches the prey or not, it's an exciting thing to look at. But it's probably not as important as all those nature specials might make us think. Now we're going to think of the interactions or analyze the interactions in terms of the two populations that are involved. And we'll think about interactions between two populations, but notice, predators can eat more than one type of prey. Prey can be attacked by more than one type of predator. So in predation, the predator population benefits. Not too surprising, they're getting nutrients, they're getting nutrition. If we have a lion that catches a zebra, that's food for the whole pride of lions. And there's a definite cost to the prey population. So we want to keep this in mind. If we were just giving plus and minus signs, the predator population would get a plus, the prey population would get a minus sign. Their numbers are going to decrease as a consequence of this interaction. So the idea that predation is super important in nature is somewhat of a myth. And not just because of the fact that it's dramatic to show the lion chasing the zebra, but also because a lot of nature shows make it seem like the predators really control the prey of the population. However, keep in mind, predation is a biotic form of population control. And remember that biotic forms of population control are density dependent, which means if the population gets large, they have a bigger effect. When the population of the prey is small, they have a smaller effect. So really, predation is not usually the major factor, the major even biotic factor controlling a prey population. So we want to keep that in mind. And that's true for almost all the biotic factors because they're density dependent. So this means when the population gets a little bit smaller, the effects of the biotic factors get smaller. So let's think about predation in kind of some general terms. We can talk about what we call general predators. And the key with general predators is they feed on lots of different prey species. And because they feed on lots of different prey species, they don't generally do much at all to control the prey population for any of those species. Why? Well, remember that example that I gave you the other day. If there's lots of rabbits, they hunt rabbits and they ignore squirrels and mice. If there's lots of zebra, the lions may get obsessed with zebra and forget about wildebeest and antelopes for a while. So as a consequence, general predators don't have as much of an impact as we might think from watching TV. Some of the evidence that we can think about that reinforces this idea is if we look at success rates of predators. And what we mean by a success rate is what happens when the predator actually starts attacking a prey, or at least chasing a prey. It may never catch the prey. If we look at some animals that we're familiar with, cheetahs are successful in about 58% of their actual pursuits. Now notice, this refers to once they start actually chasing a species. Their actual rate of success is about a half of that or a third of that. So 29% or 19%, because this success rate, 58%, is only talking about what happens once the cheetah attacks something, once it starts running full speed to chase a zebra. What it doesn't refer to is how often, you may not be aware, but cheetahs are very good sprinters. They can run 65, 70 miles an hour, but they can only do it for about 200 or 300 yards. So one of the things to keep in mind, if you're being chased by a zebra, don't pace yourself. This isn't a marathon, this is a sprint. If a cheetah doesn't catch its prey in about 200 or 300 yards, it poops out and stops. It may kind of half-heartedly trot after the prey, and if the prey doesn't try to get away, after it rests, it may chase again, but cheetahs are sprinters. So what cheetahs do to hunt is they crawl on their bellies through the tall grass in the African savanna, and they get as close as they can to their prey before they jump out and start chasing it. Because if you're a sprinter, the closer you can get before the race starts, the better your chance of success. So when we say their success rate is 58%, that's when they actually start running. But if we take into account all the times they try to sneak up on somebody on their belly and they get discovered when they're too far away and walk away kind of disgusted, it's really a half or a third of that. Lions, the king of beasts, are only successful on about 19% of their hunts. If they're hunting with a pride, they can be successful a little more often, up to about 30%. But notice, that's still less than a third of all the times they attempt to catch prey. Timber wolves are successful about 15% of the time. So when we look at mammals, notice that mammals are not successful a large percentage of the time when they attack prey. Actually, the most successful predators are things that we don't think of as predators, because when we think of predators, we think of lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But if we look at certain types of dragonflies, they succeed about 95% of their hunts. So a very high success rate. When they attack prey, that prey is a goner pretty much. They're going to catch it. Most mammalian predators that have been studied are somewhere around 10%. A little bit lower, a little bit higher, but mammals are not the best examples of successful predators. The other thing we have to keep in mind is all predators are not what we think of when we think of mammal predators. Again, mostly from TV specials, what do we think of when we think of a predator? We think of a cheetah chasing a zebra, or we think of a pride of lions chasing a zebra. But a lot of predators, you've all heard of anacondas, large snakes. Anacondas are what are called sit and wait predators. Anacondas don't slither through the jungle and try to catch, they usually eat small deer, small pigs, small animals. They don't slither through the forest looking for small animals. Depending on their size, anacondas may wait with their body mostly underwater. They may hang from a tree branch, and they wait for their prey to basically walk into them. That's when they strike. Now they can afford to be a little more patient, because keep in mind that when we look at lions or cheetahs, One of the main differences between lions and cheetahs and anacondas is lions and cheetahs are endothermic and homeothermic. They have a high body temperature. So remember what we said, that means they require a lot of food. Anacondas are ectothermic and heterothermic. And as a result, they don't need very much food. They can sit and wait for their food to come to them. They're not going to starve to death very rapidly. Really, the only type of predators that have been studied that really have an impact on the prey species is specialized predators. Specialized predators feed on one or sometimes two or three closely related species. And since that's the only thing that they feed on, literally they will keep hunting that prey until they drive it into extinction. One of the best examples is something called wasp parasitoids. So these are a type of wasp, you can tell by the name. Parasitoids, when we see something that ends in OID, OID means like or similar to. So these are similar to parasites. Now remember, insects have a life cycle where they lay eggs. The eggs hatch and form a larva, like a maggot or a caterpillar. And the larva is a feeding stage. And then the larva forms a pupa, like a cocoon on a butterfly. And the cocoon, an adult emerges out of that. Wasp parasitoids lay their eggs on insect larvae, mostly caterpillars, but not all. And when the eggs hatch, they eat the larva. So here's a caterpillar. This particular type of caterpillar is something called a tobacco hornworm because it lives on tobacco plants. And all those little white ovals are wasp parasitoid eggs. So when those eggs hatch, they hatch into small maggot-like organisms, and the maggots start eating this caterpillar. In some cases, the wasp parasitoids, their ovipositor, the thing that they attach the eggs with, is shaped kind of like a spear, and they actually poke the caterpillar and they put the eggs inside the caterpillar. So the eggs eat the caterpillar from the inside out. And these organisms are so effective in controlling the population of the prey that they feed on that there are places where you can actually buy wasp parasitoid eggs. Now you have to buy the right type to kill whatever the pest in your garden is. But once you have these wasp parasitoids, what they do is they will start laying eggs on all the larvae of the particular prey that they feed on. And at that point, notice they drive their prey organism extinct. Not extinct around the whole world necessarily, mind you, but extinct in your backyard, in your garden. And after their prey goes extinct, then the wasp parasitoids go extinct shortly thereafter. Unless your neighbors happen to have a garden where there are some more prey organisms or something that they can feed on. So this is a form of biological pest control because you're not spraying chemicals or anything. You're using a living organism. And in this case, it's very effective, and there are really few side effects because these wasp parasitoids don't feed on other insects. So as a consequence, they don't kill all the insects in your neighborhood, which would cause a problem. They simply kill one particular type of insect. Now, another type of predator that we see is what are called keystone predators. And keystone predators influence the basic structure of a community. And when we say structure, what we're talking about, it could be the actual type of plants that we find in the community, but they affect the diversity, how many different species are found in the community. And they do this because of their pattern of predation. One of the best examples, or most studied examples, is sea otters off the western coast of North America. The western coast of North America, the oceans in that area, have been used as the setting for lots of movies where there are scuba divers. Because if you go scuba diving in the area off the west coast, there are large forests of kelp. Remember that kelp is one of the brown algae, one of the protists that we talked about earlier, except kelp are by far the largest of the protists. Kelp can be up to 30, 40, 50 feet long, and they're a type of algae. So they have an attachment to the bottom of the ocean, and then they have a couple of organs. They have a stipe, which works kind of like a stem. They have structures similar to leaves, and they also have air bladders that help the plant float. So they're used in movies that show scuba diving. Whenever you see scuba divers swimming through what looks like kind of an underwater jungle. That's usually shot in a kelp forest. They are found in other places of the world besides off the west coast of the United States. But with Hollywood there, that's why that gets used a lot. So let's look at a keystone species and see, first of all, what a keystone is. A keystone is part of an architectural structure called an arch. And if we look at an arch, the way that an arch is able to stand up is because there is a stone on the top in the middle of the arch called a keystone. And the other stones that make up our arch are gradually curved. And what this keystone does is this keystone directs the pressure from the right side and the left side against each other. So they press against each other, but no movement occurs. Without the keystone, the arch collapses. Building arches is tricky because of the fact that we need this keystone. So how do you get the right side and the left side built without the keystone in place originally? I'm not going to talk too much about that. That's a subject for an architecture class. If we look at kelp forests, here we have a kelp forest. We have some sea urchins down here. Sea urchins are a type of echinoderm, and sea urchins eat kelp. So sea urchins potentially could destroy this kelp forest. Sea otters feed on the sea urchins and reduce their population. And they reduce their population so far that the kelp is able to survive. And because the kelp is this long photosynthetic structure, most of the other organisms in this environment depend on the kelp, either directly or indirectly, in the sense that species A depends on the kelp and species B eats species A. When otters disappear from an area off the west coast, what we see is that the population of sea urchins, these little purple blobs, multiplies, and they feed on the kelp and they destroy this kelp forest. Now notice this picture is also something good to pay attention to from another point of view. This picture shows this sea otter floating on its back. Sea otters are really good swimmers, they can do that. And sea otters are a good example of why tool use is not something that's limited to humans or even to primates. Besides eating sea urchins, sea otters like to eat clams and oysters, but there's a problem. Clams and oysters have a hard shell, and their muscles are so strong, a clam or oyster shell can't be opened by a really strong person, much less a little sea otter. So what do? Sea otters will pick up small flat rocks from the bottom of the ocean, and they lay them on their stomach as they're floating around. And they also pick up these oysters or clams. And what they do is, with their front paws, they smash the clam or the oyster against the rock to crack it open. And then they can get to the juicy part inside. So here's an example of something that you might not think uses tools that does. So again, we talked about the idea that one of the ideas that was floated when people first began thinking about human evolution is that tool use must have been the characteristic that evolved first, that made us different from other organisms. No, turns out lots of other things use tools. Now, not as complicated as a computer or, anything like that, but there are lots of organisms that use tools. Now, what we do know is predation often influences the life history strategy of prey populations or organisms within that population. There have been several studies that show when we look at two populations of a single prey species, if one of the populations has a high predation rate, then over time, they gradually start to mature faster and begin reproducing at a younger age. If we have another population of the same species that doesn't suffer from high predation rates, then they gradually, over a long period of time, and notice we're talking about multiple generations, over a long period of time, they may start to mature a little bit later and begin reproducing a little bit later. And of course, predation can often lead to coevolution. When we talked about evolution earlier, we talked about something that we see in mammals, which is in mammals, prey organisms tend to evolve to get faster so they can outrun their predators. Predators don't necessarily evolve to get faster, at least in mammalian predators. They tend to evolve bigger brains so that they can outsmart their prey. If we look at lions hunting in a pride, for instance, what we see is when lions hunt in a pride, usually what they do is if they're stalking a herd of zebra, most of the lions go downwind. Downwind is the direction that the wind is blowing. One or two lions go upwind and they hide, and then at some point they pop out so that the zebra can hear them or smell them and see them. And when the zebra can see the lions, they start running the opposite direction. Except what's in the opposite direction? The lions that are hiding downwind. So it's an ambush. So predators, mammalian predators at least, tend to outsmart the prey. Prey tend to outrun their predators. And notice there are aids to outrunning, or if you live in the water, outswimming your predators. Why should zebras have stripes? Well, studies have shown that the stripes on zebras provide good camouflage if you're looking at them from a long distance away. It kind of looks like blades of grass and then the spaces between blades of grass. But what about if you're up close? There have been some studies that suggest that, if you're a lion and you're in the midst of a herd of zebras and they're all running in different directions, that all those black and white stripes going by you is confusing. It's hard to draw a bead on one particular zebra. And if you've ever seen any of the nature shows where they show predation of zebras, what do lions or cheetahs or some of the other predators in Africa do when they attack a zebra? They isolate one zebra from the rest of the herd. Then you don't have all this confusing pattern. Notice that the same thing explains why you have those schools of fish in the ocean. When you look at those schools of fish that swim and seemingly turn at exactly the same time to the right or left, what's the advantage of being in a school of fish like that? When a predator, when a shark or some large fish, a dolphin, comes into the middle of that, all the different fish moving in different directions at the same time make it hard to focus on one fish and get that particular fish. So predation is interesting to watch. Yeah, maybe not so important. Now, something that's similar to predation, it doesn't get very much press in the media because it's not nearly as fun to watch, is herbivory, which is heterotrophs eating autotrophs, cows grazing on grass, or zebras, or somebody eating leaves off a tree. That's not very dramatic. There's not much of a chase involved. There's no real blood and gore. So you don't see a lot of that. But herbivory and also parasitism are very similar to predation in the sense that one population is going to benefit. Now, which population benefits? Well, the herbivore or the parasite. The other population is harmed. Which one is harmed? Well, the autotroph, the photosynthetic organism, or the host that the parasite lives in or on. If we look at mammalian herbivores, they're usually classified as either grazers, and grazers eat grasses, or browsers, and browsers eat leaves off bushes and trees. So for instance, giraffes are browsers. Now, there are actually some differences that we can see between these groups. Grasses are very tough material. They have a lot of cellulose, they have thick cell walls, and as a result, grazers have teeth with thicker enamel. And if you look at the cusps on their teeth, those are those ridges that you can see on your own molars in the back of your mouth. If you look at the cusps are higher. And over the course of their life, the enamel gets worn down so that it's thinner, and the cusps get worn down so that they're lower. The same thing happens with browsers, just not quite as quickly or to quite the same extent. Now, one of the things about this is teeth, especially the enamel in the teeth, are really the hardest materials in the body. So teeth fossilize very easily. And this means when paleontologists find teeth, we can infer the diets of extinct species. So if we look at two extinct relatives of elephants, for instance, mastodons and mammoths, what we find is that one of those groups was actually browsers, and one of those groups was grazers. And the way we can tell is by looking at the structure of their teeth. Now, it's a little bit harder when we look at animals that aren't mammals, because one of the things that makes mammals mammals, remember we said you could use the same criteria we learned way back in grade school. Mammals have hair, they suckle their young with milk, but there's another difference as well. When we look at mammals, mammals have specialized teeth. People have teeth in the very front that we call incisors. Then we have teeth to the side called canines. And then we have some teeth called bicuspids or premolars. And then we have molars in the back. If we look at the teeth in reptiles, or if we look at the teeth in sharks, basically all the teeth are the same. There's not much difference. Now, why is it all the same? Well, because they have kind of, I guess I would say, general purpose teeth. So they're not real great for eating plants, but they're okay. They're not real great for eating meat, but they're okay. Unlike animals, they don't have specialized teeth. Now, a lot of the herbivory that happens, people don't even notice. Here's what's left of a leaf with a couple of caterpillars on it. And notice, you can tell by the rough shape of this leaf, that most of this leaf has actually been eaten. So insects do an incredible amount of herbivory, but most of it we don't really notice. And the reason we don't notice is because it's a leaf or two at a time. The insects are small enough, you don't see them actually eating the plant. So as a consequence, unless you have a garden and you recognize that, all the leaves on your tomato plants are getting eaten, you don't necessarily pay attention to insects in terms of eating plants. But research suggests, and think about how many insects there are. So this is one of those things that is a little bit surprising, but not completely. Insects eat more of the plant material in most communities that gets eaten than mammals do, or vertebrates in general. So insects do an incredible amount of damage. Let me see something here. Okay. Now, what seems to have the biggest impact on a lot of populations when we look at what affects their size is competition. And we talked about competition way back when we talked about Darwin. Competition is just the use of the same resources. And when we think about it in connection with ecology, we could be talking about use of the same resources by individuals in a population of one species, or we could be talking about competition between individuals that are in completely different species. For instance, cows eat grass, buffalo eat grass, zebras eat grass, horses eat grass. So if you have organisms like that living in the same community, there's some competition for food. But the most intense competition is always within a single species. Because if you think about, it doesn't matter what, horses, robins, sharks, people, walking sticks, all the members of one species have the same requirements. They need the same thing to survive and reproduce. They even need the same type of mates. Whereas, with horses and zebras in the same environment, they don't need the same mates. Their other requirements may be almost the same, but they mate with different organisms. So intraspecific has a very direct effect on population size. Intra means within. So intraspecific competition is competition within one species. So the zebra is competing with the other zebras. The walking sticks competing with other walking sticks. The hammerhead sharks competing with other hammerhead sharks. So this has a very direct impact on population. And one of the impacts that it has when we look at what we call the niche of an organism, and a niche is sometimes described as an organism's job description in the environment. Exactly how does it survive? One of the things that we see is if a population is large, so that there's very intense intraspecific competition, there's a broader realized niche. Now, when we say there's a broader realized niche, we have to think about a couple of things. So first of all, let's go back to what I just said. A niche is how an organism survives in the environment. So it's what it eats, but it's not just what it eats, but it's when does it eat? Where does it eat? How frequently does it eat? Where does it build its nests or dens? Where does it hide from predators? It's anything you can imagine. So in this case, the x-axis represents, we're somehow combining all these different factors into one value, and this is the possible niche. If the population of any particular species is large, what we call the realized niche is broader. The realized niche is where they actually live. Now notice the possible niche, all the green from one end of this normal distribution to the other. The possible niche is where they could live. This is kind of the extremes of where they could live. The niche is broader. The species spreads out and occupies environments that maybe aren't the best. People could live at a lot of different temperatures. But if you think about living in the Arctic, where some of the Inuit and other Eskimo tribes live, that's probably not the ideal environment. So if the population is large, the realized niche gets bigger. Here's the realized niche up at the top, where the population size is just kind of average. So if we have a large population, if there's a lot of interest-specific competition, the organisms spread out. Some of them start living in more marginal habitats. Yeah, things aren't the best, but what's the good point about living in a marginal habitat? Well, at least you don't have as much competition. Not as many individuals want to live out there. The y-axis is how many individuals are living in any particular habitat. Now, competition is interspecific. Inter means between. So intraspecific is within a single population. Interspecific competition is competition between organisms in two different species. Now, it's usually not as intense because in interspecific competition, usually the competitors are only fighting over one or a few resources. You know, they might eat the same type of food. They might build their nest in the same area. But all the resources that they need are not the same. So as a result, the competition usually isn't quite as intense. So if we look at interspecific competition, which is the second graph on our chart, if we have other organisms, other populations of different species that are competing, it usually forces their competitors into a narrower niche. Why? Well, because the other organisms don't require exactly what you do. So basically it forces everybody to focus on what they do best. So the niche becomes narrower. So we want to keep this in mind. Now, notice in competition, we said we were going to think about the interactions in terms of the numbers. There's a cost to the populations of all the competing species. Whether there's 2 or 4 or 16, it doesn't matter. Why is there a cost? Well, think about this. If we have several organisms, if we have zebras, horses, buffalo, antelopes, all eating grass in the area that we're looking at, there's less grass to go around for the horses, but there's also less grass to go around for the zebras. And there's also less grass to go around for the buffalo. So if we have competition, all the populations will be at a lower level. So without their competitors there, their populations could increase. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, when we look at organisms competing, the more similar their niches are, the more intense their competition is going to be. So let's look at some of the things that can happen when competitors come into contact, when they both live in the same community, in other words. What can happen to reduce or eliminate competition? So when competition was first studied, it was studied by a biologist who was also a mathematician. And he came up with what's called Gauss's principle of competitive exclusion. And his principle of competitive exclusion says no two organisms in the same community can occupy the exact same niche. Now, remember what we said a moment ago. Usually different organisms only compete for one resource or two resources. They don't compete for all of them. Now, the reason that Gauss says this is true is because if one species is even slightly more efficient, maybe they're just 1% better at the other species than catching food, or maybe they're 0.01% better. But if these organisms have exactly the same niche, so they need the same food, the same places to build their nests, the same places to hide from predators, the more efficient species is always going to drive the less efficient species into extinction. Now, kind of like we said with our wasp parasitoids earlier, maybe they won't be extinct around the world, but they'll be extinct at least in that little area. Now, Gauss did a couple of experiments, but he based some of these, his first ideas, on experiments that he did with something called tribolium. And tribolium is flower beetles. If you've ever picked up a container of flour and you've seen some little black bugs in it, that's tribolium. Tribolium lives in flour. Notice that tribolium has a typical life cycle like other insects. It lays eggs. The eggs hatch into a larva. The larva looks kind of like a caterpillar, and this larva crawls around in the flour, eating flour. Eventually, when it's gone through several moltings, the larva forms a pupa, kind of similar to a cocoon. The body is reorganized and the body forms an adult tribolium. Tribolium is a type of beetle. The adults mate, lay eggs, and the life cycle begins again. Now, Gauss took 2 species of tribolium and he put them into a jar of flour. And he basically used glass jars so he could observe what was going on if he wanted. And when he did these experiments, he used the same species over and over again. One species always drove the other into extinction. So that's where he came up with his principle of competitive exclusion. But think about the environment that these beetles are in. They're in an environment that's very homogeneous. It's the same. It's basically just these little granules of flour. So after he had done this several times, he added some small glass tubes to the flour, and these glass tubes were hollow. And when he did this, both species survived. So what this showed was that if the environment is more complex, then you can have 2 species that have very similar requirements, that live in almost exactly the same niche, but they're able to survive. Now, how were they able to do this? Well, it turned out that what Gauss discovered when he looked at it more closely was if he looked at the larva stage, this was the key. One of the species, when they larva formed a pupa, the adults of the other species ate the pupa. So this is what drove the less efficient species, if you will, into extinction. However, when Gauss put his little hollow tubes into the wheat, the larvae of the species that had gone extinct before crawled into these little hollow tubes when they were getting ready to pupate, to form a pupa. And the species that was driven extinct was slightly smaller. So the adults of the other species couldn't crawl into these little hollow tubes. So that meant the larva lived long enough to form pupa, and then the pupa actually lived long enough to form adults. So notice, this is still a pretty simple environment. We have granules of flour. We have, little hollow tubes. That's much less complex than what we see in your own front yard, where we have lots of different types of plants, where we have tiny holes in the soil, where we have spots that are in the shade under a dandelion leaf or at the bottom of the grass, and we have spots that are in the sun. So this suggests that in real life, competitive exclusion probably doesn't happen that often. Now, the same types of experiments were done with paramecium. You might remember paramecium is a single-celled protist, and it lives in water. And they took 2 species. And in one species, what they found out was if they were in a little test tube with water, the population gradually approached 100% of what the environment could support. In other words, the carrying capacity. The other species never quite got to that point. It got to about 60% of what the population would support. But if you put the 2 populations in the same test tube of water, population that grew more slowly and leveled off at a lower number gradually went extinct. And the population that reproduced more rapidly, it took them a little bit longer and the shape of the curve changed, but eventually they drove the other species into extinction. So one of the things that could happen when we have competition is competitive exclusion. If one organism is enough more efficient than the other organism is driven into extinction, at least in that local area where the 2 species both live. So are there any questions about predation or competition so far? If not, I will let you go for the day. And on Wednesday, we'll continue talking about competition. We still have a couple of other types of interactions we haven't gotten to yet. So we'll try to finish those up on Wednesday. So if you have some questions, you're welcome to ask questions. If you don't have any questions, you're welcome to leave for now.